Pastor Jonathan Hale had spent nearly 20 years preaching that no secret remained hidden forever. Every Sunday morning, his calm voice echoed through the wooden beams of Ashbrook Community Church, reminding neighbors that truth had a way of finding daylight, no matter how deeply it was buried. The people of Ashbrook trusted him with their grief, their confessions, and their hopes. To them, Jonathan was more than a pastor. He was the steady heartbeat of a town where everyone believed kindness still outweighed cruelty. The annual church anniversary banquet was the largest celebration of the year. Volunteers had transformed the fellowship hall into a warm gathering place with white tablecloths, candles, and bouquets of fresh lilies lining each table. Laughter filled the room as families shared stories over roasted chicken, homemade bread, and slices of apple pie. Children darted between tables while older members smiled proudly at photographs displaying the church's history. Jonathan stood near the podium greeting guests with the same gentle smile that had comforted countless broken hearts. Yet anyone looking closely would have noticed something was different. His smile appeared strained, lingering a second too long before fading. His hands trembled whenever he accepted another handshake. Beads of sweat gathered beneath his collar despite the cool evening air drifting through the open windows. Rebecca Hale noticed every movement. She sat gracefully beside the head table, thanking donors and exchanging pleasant conversation with church members. Her elegant appearance reflected everything the congregation admired about her. She wore a navy blue dress, a silver cross necklace, and an expression of quiet confidence that seemed perfectly suited for the wife of Ashbrook's beloved pastor. Only Jonathan recognized the fear hidden behind her composed smile. Throughout dinner, their eyes met repeatedly across the table. Each glance carried silent questions neither dared ask aloud. Jonathan reached for his glass of wine but hesitated before taking a sip. Rebecca watched his fingers tighten around the stem until his knuckles turned pale. Several church elders assumed the pastor was simply overwhelmed by emotion. "He's probably preparing one of those unforgettable speeches," whispered Deacon William Foster to his wife. "He deserves this celebration," she replied warmly. "No one has given more to this community." Jonathan finally stepped toward the podium as quiet applause spread across the hall. The room settled into complete silence. He looked across the familiar faces that had trusted him for decades. "I've spent much of my life encouraging others to tell the truth," he began softly. "Tonight, there is something weighing heavily on my heart." Rebecca's smile disappeared. Jonathan paused. His breathing became uneven. For a brief moment, it seemed he might abandon whatever burden had followed him into the room. Instead, he turned toward his wife. "Rebecca," he said quietly, his voice barely carrying beyond the head table, "I can't keep protecting it anymore." Her eyes widened. "Jonathan," she whispered urgently, forcing another smile for nearby guests. "Please, not here. I should have spoken years ago. You don't understand what will happen." "I understand exactly what will happen." Fear replaced every trace of warmth on Rebecca's face. "If you do this," she murmured through clenched teeth, "you'll destroy everything." Jonathan lowered his eyes. "No," he answered gently. "The secret already has." For several endless seconds, neither of them moved. The surrounding conversations resumed as guests assumed the couple was discussing the evening's program. Jonathan slowly lifted his wineglass. Rebecca watched every movement. His fingers trembled again before he finally drank. He returned to the microphone, clearing his throat as though gathering the courage for one final confession. "My friends," he began, "before this evening ends, there is something all of you deserve to." The sentence never finished. Jonathan suddenly froze. The wineglass slipped from his hand, crashing against the polished floor. Crimson liquid splashed across the white tablecloth as he clutched his chest. His face drained of color. His breathing became short, desperate gasps. Someone screamed. Jonathan staggered backward before collapsing heavily onto the floor. Guests rushed from every direction. Chairs scraped violently across the room while frightened voices called his name. Rebecca dropped beside him, crying for someone to call an ambulance as church members surrounded the fallen pastor in stunned disbelief. An elderly nurse checked for a pulse while another volunteer began chest compressions. Several people knelt together in prayer, convinced they were witnessing a sudden heart attack. Jonathan's fading eyes met Rebecca's one last time. For the briefest instant, terror flickered across her face before sorrow replaced it. Outside, distant sirens echoed through Ashbrook's quiet streets, growing louder with every passing second. No one inside the fellowship hall realized they were no longer witnessing a tragic medical emergency. They were standing at the beginning of a murder investigation. Morning sunlight spread across Ashbrook, but its warmth did little to comfort a town shaken by the shocking death of its beloved pastor. Church bells remained silent for the first time in decades, and black ribbons hung from the entrance of Ashbrook Community Church. Neighbors gathered in small groups, exchanging whispers that sounded more like prayers than conversations. Everyone repeated the same heartbreaking belief. Jonathan Hale had suffered a fatal heart attack while preparing one final message for his congregation. Rebecca Hale stood at the front of the church sanctuary dressed in black, accepting endless embraces from grieving friends. Her eyes were swollen with carefully measured tears, and her voice remained soft as she thanked each visitor for their kindness. Elderly church members praised her remarkable strength, while younger families offered meals, flowers, and promises that she would never face the coming days alone. To nearly everyone present, Rebecca appeared to be the picture of quiet dignity amid unimaginable loss. Yet not everyone saw comfort in her composure. Several members noticed that Rebecca never asked questions about Jonathan's final moments. She never wondered whether he had suffered or whether doctors had found a medical explanation. Instead, she listened politely before changing the subject, as though she feared lingering too long on the details of his death. By late afternoon, the county medical examiner contacted the sheriff's office with unexpected preliminary findings. Tiny traces of an uncommon poison had been detected during the initial examination. Although further laboratory testing would be required, the evidence was alarming enough to halt funeral preparations immediately. Within an hour, Detective Olivia Grant arrived in Ashbrook. Olivia had spent 15 years investigating murders disguised as accidents, suicides, and natural deaths. She possessed a calm confidence that unsettled guilty people far more than loud accusations ever could. As she stepped through the church doors, she quietly observed every face before introducing herself to local deputies. "This is no longer a routine death," she said. "Until we know otherwise, we're treating Pastor Hale's death as a homicide." The announcement spread through the church like wildfire. Shock turned into disbelief. Some members refused to accept it, insisting Jonathan had no enemies. Others exchanged nervous glances, wondering who could possibly want such a gentle man dead. Rebecca lowered her head and covered her mouth with trembling fingers. "Murder?" she whispered. "That can't be true." Olivia watched her carefully. "I understand this is difficult," the detective said gently. "We'll need to ask everyone a few questions." Rebecca nodded without protest. She answered every question calmly, explaining that Jonathan had seemed nervous for several weeks but blamed the church's financial pressures and upcoming anniversary celebration. She denied noticing anything unusual about his dinner, except that he barely touched his food. Olivia wrote each answer into her notebook while studying Rebecca's expressions more closely than her words. Nothing Rebecca said sounded rehearsed. That was precisely what troubled her. Meanwhile, crime scene investigators entered Jonathan's private office behind the sanctuary. The modest room reflected the pastor's simple life. Shelves overflowed with theology books, handwritten sermons, family photographs, and neatly organized counseling files. At first glance, everything appeared untouched. Then one investigator frowned. "Detective," he called. Olivia stepped inside. A desk drawer had been forced open. Papers were scattered unnaturally across the floor, while several folders sat half open, as if someone had searched them in great haste. Dust patterns revealed that framed photographs had recently been moved before being placed back almost exactly where they belonged. "Who found the office first?" Olivia asked. "The assistant pastor unlocked it this morning," a deputy replied. "He says it already looked like this." Olivia slowly walked around the room. Whoever entered had known exactly where to search. Nothing valuable had been stolen. Cash remained inside an envelope. Jonathan's laptop still rested on the desk. Expensive ceremonial gifts displayed on nearby shelves had not been disturbed. Only documents appeared to interest the intruder. Rebecca was brought to the doorway after investigators completed their photographs. "Have you ever seen the office like this?" Olivia asked. Rebecca looked around with convincing confusion. "No," she answered quietly. "Jonathan kept everything organized. He hated clutter. Do you know who might have searched it?" She shook her head. "I honestly don't." Olivia believed Rebecca was hiding something, though not necessarily because she had searched the office herself. The detective glanced toward the pastor's desk, where an empty space suggested something important had recently disappeared. Financial records alone could not explain such desperation. As officers carefully boxed the remaining documents into evidence containers, Olivia found herself replaying Jonathan's unfinished words from the anniversary dinner. He had been preparing to reveal something. Whatever secret died with him had been important enough for someone to poison a respected pastor, and important enough for another person to search his office before investigators ever arrived. Olivia silently promised herself that the missing truth would not stay buried for long. Detective Olivia Grant left the evidence room carrying more questions than answers. The missing item from Jonathan Hale's office continued to trouble her. Whoever had searched the room had ignored valuables and focused entirely on documents. That meant the motive behind the murder was almost certainly connected to information rather than money. Standing outside the church beneath gray morning skies, Olivia studied the building's stained glass windows. Somewhere inside those walls, Jonathan had hidden something he believed was worth protecting, even at the cost of his own life. The church secretary, Grace Turner, arrived shortly after sunrise. She had served beside Jonathan for nearly 18 years and knew his daily habits better than almost anyone else. Her eyes were red from crying, but she remained composed as Olivia invited her into a quiet meeting room. "I know this is difficult," Olivia began gently. "I'm trying to understand what Pastor Hale may have been working on before he died." Grace folded her hands together. "Jonathan never kept secrets for himself," she said softly, "but he carried other people's burdens every day." Olivia nodded. "Did he ever mention writing anything personal?" Grace hesitated before answering. "About 2 months ago, he told me he had started keeping a private journal. He said some confessions couldn't remain inside his head forever. He wanted to leave behind a written record that could protect innocent people if something ever happened to him." Olivia leaned forward immediately. "Did he say where he kept it?" Grace looked toward the sanctuary. "He always carried it home except on counseling days. Sometimes he locked it inside the bottom drawer of his office desk." The detective exchanged a quick glance with one of her deputies. The forced drawer suddenly made perfect sense. Investigators returned to Jonathan's office and searched every shelf, cabinet, and storage box again. Nearly 2 hours passed before a young evidence technician noticed something unusual behind a row of old hymn books. Hidden inside a narrow gap rested a worn leather journal wrapped in a faded cloth cover. Olivia carefully slipped on fresh gloves before opening it. Several pages had already been ripped away. The torn edges looked fresh, leaving rough fibers that suggested whoever removed them had acted quickly and violently rather than carefully. She began reading the remaining entries. Jonathan described sleepless nights filled with fear, prayer, and guilt. He repeatedly referred to a terrible discovery involving someone he loved deeply. Each passage grew more emotional than the last, yet every name had been deliberately omitted. One sentence appeared again and again across multiple entries. "The truth will destroy everything we built." Olivia paused. Whatever Jonathan feared, it clearly reached far beyond ordinary church problems. The following page described his struggle between compassion and responsibility. "I promised silence once," he had written, "but silence has become another form of sin." The next several pages were missing. Grace stood quietly behind Olivia. "I've never heard him sound so hopeless," she whispered. "He believed someone innocent still needed protection," Olivia replied thoughtfully. The journal ended abruptly with another incomplete entry. "I cannot allow this burden to survive another generation." During the anniversary dinner, Everyone will finally know. Nothing followed. Olivia closed the journal slowly. Someone had removed exactly the pages most likely to identify the person Jonathan intended to expose. Across town, Rebecca Hale sat alone inside her darkened living room pretending to grieve, while replaying every word Jonathan had spoken before collapsing. He had hidden the journal. If detectives found the missing pages, everything would be over. Long after midnight, Rebecca quietly left her house wearing a dark coat and gloves. Empty streets carried only the sound of distant wind as she approached the silent church. Using her personal key, she slipped inside without turning on the lights. Moonlight spilled through stained glass windows, painting faint colors across the sanctuary floor. Rebecca moved quickly toward Jonathan's office. Every drawer had already been emptied by investigators, yet she searched desperately beneath furniture, inside books, behind picture frames, and beneath loose floorboards. Panic tightened her breathing with every passing minute. "They have to be here," she whispered to herself. "They can't disappear." She froze after hearing the faint creak of an opening door somewhere deeper inside the building. Footsteps echoed through the dark hallway. Rebecca quickly switched off her flashlight and slipped behind the office door, holding her breath as another shadow slowly approached. Someone else had come searching for Jonathan's missing pages before dawn. Rebecca pressed herself against the office wall, barely daring to breathe as slow footsteps echoed through the hallway outside. Moonlight stretched across the floor, turning familiar surroundings into distorted shadows. She expected detectives to burst through the doorway, but instead the footsteps paused, lingered for several seconds, then gradually faded into the distance. After waiting another minute, she slipped quietly from the office, abandoned her frantic search, and disappeared into the darkness before anyone saw her. By sunrise, she was once again the grieving widow, her fear carefully hidden behind practiced composure. Detective Olivia Grant received a report about signs of unauthorized entry at the church later that morning. Although nothing appeared stolen, the disturbance confirmed someone else was still searching for whatever Jonathan Hale had hidden. Olivia ordered additional security around the church and instructed officers to document every visitor entering the property. Whoever had returned during the night clearly believed crucial evidence remained undiscovered. While investigators searched for answers, memories Rebecca had buried for decades began surfacing with increasing force. When she first met Jonathan 23 years earlier, she had been charming, intelligent, and quietly reserved. Jonathan admired her compassion and unwavering dedication to helping vulnerable families through the church's outreach programs. Their friendship quickly grew into romance, and within a year they married before hundreds of joyful guests. To Ashbrook, they became the perfect couple, admired for their kindness, generosity, and unwavering faith. Photographs displayed throughout their home captured smiling vacations, anniversary celebrations, and community events. Every picture reinforced the same illusion. Behind closed doors, however, their marriage slowly transformed into something entirely different. Jonathan remained patient, believing love required sacrifice and understanding. Rebecca became increasingly protective of her privacy, avoiding conversations about her childhood whenever Jonathan gently asked questions. Entire portions of her past simply did not exist. She claimed painful memories served no purpose, insisting the future mattered more than the past. At first, Jonathan accepted her explanation. Years passed. Small arguments gradually replaced meaningful conversations. Rebecca controlled every discussion involving family history, ending uncomfortable questions with cold silence or carefully timed tears. Whenever Jonathan suggested counseling together, she accused him of doubting her honesty. "You promised never to make me relive those years," she once told him. "I'm trying to understand you," Jonathan replied quietly. "No," Rebecca answered, turning away. "You're trying to uncover things that should stay buried." The words haunted him. Looking back, Jonathan realized those conversations always ended the same way. Rebecca never defended herself with facts. She defended herself with fear. Now, sitting alone inside their empty home, Rebecca found those memories impossible to escape. Another memory forced itself into her mind. Rain hammered against an old farmhouse window 20 years earlier. A younger Rebecca stood trembling in a dim hallway, her clothes stained with mud and tears streaming down her face. Somewhere beyond the doorway, shouting suddenly stopped. A heavy silence followed. Rebecca slowly stepped backward while clutching something tightly against her chest. Her breathing became frantic as another frightened voice whispered her name. Then everything blurred. Another fragment appeared. Flashing police lights reflected across wet pavement. A woman cried uncontrollably while two men carried sealed evidence boxes from the property. Someone kept repeating that one person could not be found. The memory shattered before revealing any names. Rebecca covered her face with shaking hands. "I had no choice," she whispered into the empty room. "I never had another choice." Across town, Olivia continued examining Jonathan's final weeks. Phone records revealed an unusual series of calls made shortly before his death. Most belonged to church members seeking counseling, but one number appeared repeatedly during the last month. It belonged to attorney Michael Bennett. Olivia arranged an immediate interview. Bennett welcomed her into his office with visible reluctance. "I can't discuss privileged conversations," he explained. "I'm investigating Pastor Hale's murder," Olivia replied calmly. "Anything connected to his safety matters now." The attorney remained silent before slowly opening a locked file cabinet. "Jonathan visited me 3 times, Bennett admitted. "He wasn't preparing a will or handling church finances. What was he doing? He asked me to draft a public statement." Olivia felt her pulse quicken. "A statement about what?" Bennett carefully removed a sealed envelope. He said it contained information capable of destroying lives. "He instructed me not to release it unless something happened to him before he could speak publicly." Olivia stared at the unopened envelope resting between them. Whatever Jonathan had planned to reveal had frightened him enough to prepare for his own death. And someone had apparently feared that truth even more. Detective Olivia Grant left attorney Michael Bennett's office carrying the sealed envelope Jonathan Hale had entrusted to him. Although she could not open it without proper authorization, its existence confirmed one troubling fact. Jonathan had expected his planned confession might place him in danger. That realization transformed the investigation from a straightforward poisoning case into something far more complicated. Somewhere beneath years of carefully maintained appearances lay a truth powerful enough to make a respected pastor prepare for the possibility of his own death. Back at the sheriff's office, Olivia assigned 2 detectives to examine every identifiable person connected to Rebecca Hale before her marriage. Marriage licenses, property deeds, school records, and employment files gradually formed a timeline stretching back more than 2 decades. Most entries matched Rebecca's account of her life, until the search unexpectedly reached the year before she met Jonathan. The records abruptly stopped. Instead, another name appeared beside an old residential address. Emily Carter. Olivia frowned as she opened the faded file. Emily Carter had lived in the neighboring county and shared Rebecca's birth date, physical description, and nearly identical educational history. Yet after one particular year, Emily seemed to vanish completely. Driver's license records ended. Employment files disappeared. Medical records stopped without explanation. It was as though she had simply ceased to exist. Months later, Rebecca Hale appeared for the first time in official documents. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. "Run facial comparisons," Olivia instructed her team. Several hours later, the forensic analyst returned. "The older photographs are grainy," he admitted, "but we're seeing significant similarities between Emily Carter and Rebecca Hale." Olivia studied the 2 images side by side. The hairstyle was different. The clothing reflected another era. Yet the eyes, cheekbones, and unmistakable smile appeared remarkably alike. Someone had not merely changed names. Someone had rewritten an identity. Meanwhile, Olivia requested another interview with Grace Turner. The church secretary appeared exhausted, but after several moments of thoughtful silence, she remembered something she had previously dismissed as unimportant. "There was an elderly visitor," Grace said quietly. "She came here 3 days before Jonathan died." "What was her name?" "I only remember Jonathan calling her Mrs. Whitmore." "What happened?" They spoke privately for nearly 2 hours. When she left, Jonathan looked devastated. I'd never seen him cry before. Olivia immediately located the visitor through church sign-in records. Margaret Whitmore lived alone in a modest farmhouse several miles outside Ashbrook. Despite her age, her memory remained remarkably sharp. When Olivia showed her Rebecca's photograph, the elderly woman's expression changed instantly. "I know that face," she whispered. "You've met Rebecca Hale?" Margaret slowly shook her head. "No." She pointed at the picture with trembling fingers. "That woman wasn't Rebecca when I knew her." Olivia remained silent. "She was Emily." The room fell completely still. Margaret explained that Emily Carter had once lived nearby with relatives after a terrible family tragedy. She described a frightened young woman constantly looking over her shoulder, terrified someone would recognize her. Then, without warning, Emily disappeared. "I always believed someone helped her start over," Margaret said. "Did she ever explain why?" "Only once." Margaret stared toward the window. "She told me that sometimes surviving meant becoming someone else." Driving back to town, Olivia replayed every word. Jonathan's journal, the missing pages, the sealed statement, Emily Carter, Rebecca Hale. Each clue pointed toward the same hidden past. Across town, Rebecca struggled to maintain the image everyone expected. Church members continued bringing meals and offering prayers, but every knock at the door sent panic racing through her body. She barely slept, haunted by memories she had spent decades suppressing. Every passing police car made her heart pound. Standing before her bathroom mirror, she barely recognized the exhausted woman staring back. "They're getting closer," she whispered. Her reflection offered no comfort. Later that evening, she opened a locked wooden box hidden beneath loose floorboards inside her bedroom closet. Carefully wrapped in yellowed newspaper rested several faded photographs and an aged birth certificate bearing a familiar name. Emily Carter. Rebecca's trembling hands lingered over the document before she quickly returned everything to its hiding place. Outside, headlights swept across her living room curtains. She froze. Someone had parked across the street, watching the house. As Rebecca nervously peered through the window, Detective Olivia Grant stepped from an unmarked vehicle carrying a warrant that would finally allow investigators to begin searching beyond the carefully constructed life Rebecca had spent 20 years protecting. Detective Olivia Grant stood inside Rebecca Hale's living room while forensic investigators carefully searched every corner of the house. The warrant had revealed hidden photographs, an old birth certificate bearing the name Emily Carter, and several personal keepsakes that contradicted Rebecca's carefully constructed history. Yet none of those discoveries explained Jonathan Hale's murder. Olivia knew the answer still lay somewhere within the final hours of the anniversary dinner. If she could reconstruct every minute of that evening, the truth behind the poisoning might finally emerge. The investigation shifted from searching hidden identities to rebuilding a timeline. Detectives collected surveillance footage from the church parking lot, nearby businesses, and security cameras installed inside the fellowship hall. Volunteers, servers, church elders, and musicians were interviewed separately. Each witness remembered small details that seemed meaningless alone but became significant when assembled together. Jonathan had arrived at the church shortly after 4 o'clock that afternoon. Rebecca arrived almost 30 minutes later carrying several covered dishes prepared for the celebration. Witnesses described the couple speaking quietly inside Jonathan's office before guests entered the building. Their conversation appeared tense, though neither raised a voice. Grace Turner remembered seeing Jonathan leave the office looking deeply troubled. "He asked if everything was ready," she recalled. "Then he told me tonight would change many lives." Olivia immediately wrote those words into her notebook. Another volunteer remembered Rebecca standing alone in the church kitchen only minutes later. She appeared distracted, staring at a single wine bottle resting beside serving trays before quickly closing a cabinet as someone entered. The surveillance footage confirmed that observation. Although the camera lacked audio, Rebecca remained alone in the kitchen for nearly 2 minutes. She handled Jonathan's unopened bottle of wine before placing it back exactly where she had found it. What was she doing? One deputy wondered. "We don't guess," Olivia answered. "We prove." Laboratory testing soon provided the missing piece. The poison detected inside Jonathan's body was an extremely rare plant-derived toxin. colorless, nearly tasteless, and difficult to identify without specialized testing. It could be dissolved into wine without changing its appearance. Death often resembled sudden cardiac failure, especially during the first examination. Someone had chosen the poison carefully. Someone expected investigators to believe Jonathan died naturally. Olivia replayed the surveillance footage repeatedly. Minutes before dinner began, Jonathan quietly approached Rebecca near the serving tables. Although the cameras captured no sound, a lip-reading specialist later examined the recording. The results stunned everyone. Jonathan appeared to say, "I can't wait anymore." Rebecca answered, "Please don't." Jonathan then spoke another sentence. "They deserve the truth." Rebecca's expression changed instantly. Several witnesses independently remembered seeing her leave the banquet hall immediately afterward. One choir member believed she had gone to fix her makeup. A kitchen volunteer assumed she was checking food preparations. Neither realized she had entered the serving area where Jonathan's wine remained unattended. Detectives reconstructed the sequence minute by minute. 6:42. Rebecca left the hall. 6:44. She entered the kitchen alone. 6:46. She returned carrying nothing visible. 6:48. Dinner service began. 7:12. Jonathan privately told Rebecca he could no longer remain silent. 7:14. He drank from his wineglass. 7:16. He collapsed before finishing his confession. The timeline fit perfectly. Olivia gathered her investigative team. Rebecca knew Jonathan intended to reveal something before dinner ended. She explained. She had both opportunity and preparation. This wasn't panic. It was planning. But planning for what? Another detective asked. That's still our missing piece. Rebecca continued denying every accusation during questioning. I loved my husband, she insisted calmly. Then why hide your past? Olivia asked. Rebecca lowered her eyes. My past has nothing to do with Jonathan's death. Everything suggests otherwise. She remained silent. Days passed as detectives searched financial records, counseling files, family histories, and church archives. Nothing explained why Rebecca feared exposure enough to murder the man she had shared 20 years with. Jonathan's journal repeatedly mentioned protecting innocent people. His attorney safeguarded a sealed statement. Emily Carter had vanished. Rebecca Hale had appeared. Still, the central mystery remained untouched. Why would revealing an old identity justify murder? Late one evening, Olivia returned to Jonathan's journal for another careful reading. This time she noticed faint impressions pressed into the paper beneath one torn page. Holding the notebook beneath angled light, several barely visible words emerged from the damaged surface. Not a confession. Promise. And beneath it, another incomplete sentence. She never meant to. Olivia stared at the ghostly letters, realizing Jonathan's secret might not have begun with calculated evil at all. It might have begun with a tragedy someone had spent 20 years desperately trying to survive. The faint words pressed into Jonathan Hale's journal refused to leave Detective Olivia Grant's thoughts. They suggested compassion instead of condemnation, hinting that the truth behind Rebecca Hale's hidden identity was more tragic than anyone had imagined. Rather than ordering another round of interviews, Olivia returned to the church determined to examine every overlooked item from Jonathan's office. If the missing journal pages still existed, she believed they had never truly left the building. Someone had hidden them in panic, not destroyed them. Church volunteers were helping catalog donated books for a memorial library honoring Jonathan's ministry. Hundreds of worn Bibles filled long tables inside a classroom, each carrying handwritten notes from former members. Olivia quietly searched through them while an evidence technician photographed inscriptions. One thick leather Bible immediately caught her attention. Its pages appeared unusually uneven. As she carefully opened the cover, several folded sheets slipped onto the table. The torn edges matched Jonathan's journal perfectly. Olivia held her breath before unfolding the first page. Jonathan's handwriting remained steady at first, but gradually became uneven as emotion overwhelmed him. Today, Rebecca finally trusted me with the truth she has carried alone for 20 years. I understand now why fear has lived behind her smile. She never wanted forgiveness. She only wanted the nightmare to stay buried. The next page revealed the beginning of the terrible story. Decades earlier, Rebecca had been known as Emily Carter. She and her younger sister, Sarah, grew up inside a wealthy household controlled by an abusive father whose public reputation concealed relentless violence. Behind locked doors, intimidation and cruelty ruled every day of their childhood. Emily spent years shielding Sarah from physical and emotional abuse, believing escape would someday become possible. One stormy evening, everything changed. Jonathan described Rebecca's own confession in heartbreaking detail. Their father became enraged after Sarah threatened to report his abuse. During the confrontation, he grabbed Sarah violently and dragged her toward a staircase. Emily rushed forward, desperately pulling him away. The struggle lasted only seconds before their father lost his balance. He stumbled backward into Sarah, sending both crashing over the railing. Sarah struck the stone floor below. She died instantly. Their father survived with only minor injuries. Jonathan wrote that Rebecca never stopped hearing the sound of her sister's body striking the floor. The following pages explained what happened next. Rather than reporting years of abuse, Rebecca's influential relatives feared scandal above everything else. Attorneys, family advisors, and trusted associates gathered before police arrived. Together they constructed an elaborate story claiming Sarah had disappeared after running away from home. Money and influence buried uncomfortable questions before investigators looked too closely. Emily became another problem. The family insisted she abandon her identity entirely, move away, and begin a new life under another name. They claimed it would protect everyone involved from public disgrace, while preventing renewed investigation into Sarah's disappearance. Rebecca obeyed. Not because she believed them, because she was 19 years old, traumatized, and utterly alone. Jonathan admitted that when Rebecca first confessed everything after their marriage, he believed silence was an act of mercy. He accepted her account, convinced she had acted only to protect her younger sister during a terrifying attack. I promised her, he wrote, that I would never allow anyone to reopen those wounds. Years passed before his conviction slowly changed. Counseling survivors of domestic abuse exposed Jonathan to countless stories of hidden violence protected by fear, shame, and family loyalty. Again and again he watched silence imprison victims long after bruises disappeared. Eventually he realized Rebecca's secret had never truly ended with Sarah's death. Entire generations remained trapped beneath the lie. Her abusive father had escaped public accountability. Family members who orchestrated the deception continued living respected lives. Sarah's memory remained officially erased. Jonathan's final entries revealed the impossible burden crushing his conscience. I still believe Rebecca never intended harm. She acted to save her sister. Yet keeping this hidden has allowed evil to wear respectable clothing for decades. Truth cannot heal what fear refuses to acknowledge. The last recovered page ended with heartbreaking certainty. Tomorrow I will tell the congregation everything. Rebecca may hate me forever, but perhaps she will finally become free. Olivia slowly lowered the papers. Jonathan had never intended to destroy Rebecca. He intended to release her from a prison built by powerful people long before she met him. Across town, Rebecca sat alone in the interrogation room, unaware the missing journal pages had finally been found. As detectives prepared warrants for new arrests connected to the decades-old cover-up, she stared silently at the table, believing the secret she had killed to protect remained hidden. She had no idea the truth was already beginning to unravel, and with it came the evidence that would soon place her before a jury to answer for both the past and the murder that followed. The discovery of Jonathan Hale's missing journal pages changed the investigation overnight. What had once appeared to be an isolated poisoning case now exposed decades of buried abuse, deception, and carefully protected lies. Armed with Jonathan's handwritten account, forensic evidence, surveillance footage, and Rebecca Hale's concealed identity, Detective Olivia Grant believed the prosecution finally possessed enough evidence to move forward. At sunrise, deputies arrived at Rebecca's home with an arrest warrant, ending weeks of uncertainty that had gripped the quiet town of Ashbrook. Rebecca opened the front door before officers knocked a second time. She looked exhausted, as though she had expected this moment from the night Jonathan collapsed. Rebecca Hale, the lead deputy, said quietly, "You are under arrest for the first-degree murder of Pastor Jonathan Hale." She closed her eyes. For several seconds, no one spoke. Finally, she extended her hands without resistance. "I won't run," she whispered. As handcuffs clicked around her wrists, neighbors watched silently from porches and windows. Some wept openly. Others turned away, unable to reconcile the grieving widow they had comforted with the woman now accused of killing the pastor they had loved for decades. News of the arrest spread rapidly through Ashbrook. The church community fractured almost immediately. Many members refused to believe Rebecca capable of murder. They remembered years of charity work, hospital visits, and countless evenings spent comforting struggling families beside Jonathan. To them, she remained a faithful wife crushed beneath unimaginable tragedy. Others believed the evidence could no longer be ignored. Jonathan's journal, the altered identity, the poisoned wine, the surveillance timeline. Together they painted a devastating picture. Several weeks later, the courtroom filled long before proceedings began. Wooden benches overflowed with church members, reporters, investigators, and curious residents hoping to witness the trial that had transformed their peaceful town into national headlines. Rebecca entered wearing a plain gray suit instead of the elegant dresses she once wore beside Jonathan during Sunday services. She avoided looking toward the public gallery. Detective Olivia Grant sat quietly behind the prosecution, watching every reaction inside the courtroom. The state's attorney opened with a simple argument. This case is not about whether Rebecca Hale once suffered unimaginable trauma. It is about what she chose to do when confronted with the possibility that long-hidden truth would finally become public. The prosecution carefully reconstructed Jonathan's final evening. Forensic experts explained the rare poison discovered inside Jonathan's body and demonstrated how it could be dissolved into wine without altering its appearance. Surveillance specialists presented synchronized footage establishing Rebecca's opportunity to tamper with the bottle. Laboratory analysts confirmed traces of the poison remained inside the recovered wineglass. Each witness strengthened the timeline. Grace Turner described Jonathan's growing emotional burden during his final weeks. He wasn't angry, Grace testified through tears. He was heartbroken. He kept saying truth was painful, but living without it had become even more painful. Attorney Michael Bennett testified next. He described Jonathan's repeated visits and identified the sealed statement prepared in case Jonathan died before speaking publicly. He never wanted revenge, Bennett explained. He wanted honesty. The courtroom grew silent. Finally, Detective Olivia Grant took the witness stand. She described discovering Jonathan's journal, the missing pages hidden inside the donated Bible, and the investigation linking Emily Carter to Rebecca Hale. Defense attorneys acknowledged the evidence but argued Rebecca had lived under unbearable psychological pressure for decades. When Rebecca finally chose to testify, every eye remained fixed upon her. She spoke softly. "I loved Jonathan. No one interrupted. He saved me when I believed my life was already over. He believed I deserved another chance." Her voice trembled. "But when he decided everyone needed to know, I couldn't breathe anymore." She wiped away tears. "I kept seeing my sister, my father, my family. Everything we buried was coming back." The prosecutor stood. "Did you poison your husband?" Rebecca stared at the witness stand. After a long silence, she nodded. "Yes." Gasps echoed across the courtroom. "I put poison into his wine." "Why?" Rebecca's shoulders collapsed. "Because I believed losing the truth was better than losing everyone I loved." The prosecutor spoke quietly. "But you lost Jonathan." Rebecca closed her eyes. "I know." No further questions followed. As court recessed for the evening, reporters rushed outside while jurors remained under strict supervision. Inside the nearly empty courtroom, Olivia watched Rebecca sitting alone, realizing the woman before her was neither the monster some imagined nor the innocent victim others desperately wanted to believe. She was someone whose terrible decision had been born from decades of fear. Now 12 strangers would decide whether fear could ever excuse murder. After days of emotional testimony and hours of closing arguments, The courtroom settled into an anxious silence as the jury disappeared to begin deliberations. Rebecca Hale remained seated beside her attorneys, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Detective Olivia Grant waited quietly behind the prosecution table, studying the woman whose life had been shaped by childhood terror, decades of silence, and one irreversible decision. No matter what verdict emerged, Olivia understood there would be no true winners inside that courtroom. The jury deliberated for nearly 11 hours. Outside, television cameras lined the courthouse steps while Ashbrook residents gathered in small groups, discussing every piece of testimony they had heard. Church members prayed together beneath gray skies, hoping for justice, mercy, or perhaps both. Some believed Rebecca deserved compassion because of the abuse she had survived. Others insisted Jonathan's murder erased every excuse she could ever offer. Late the following afternoon, the bailiff announced the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled within minutes. Rebecca entered slowly, her face pale but composed. She glanced briefly toward the public gallery, where familiar church members avoided her eyes. Grace Turner quietly clutched a handkerchief. Attorney Michael Bennett bowed his head. Detective Olivia Grant remained expressionless, though the weight of the moment settled heavily upon her shoulders. The judge instructed everyone to rise. "Has the jury reached a unanimous verdict?" "We have," the foreperson replied. Silence settled over the room. "On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Rebecca Hale." "Guilty," several people gasped. One elderly church member quietly began to cry. Rebecca closed her eyes as though she had rehearsed hearing those words 1,000 times. Tears rolled down her face, yet she neither protested nor pleaded. She simply lowered her head while deputies stepped forward. Before sentencing, the judge invited Rebecca to speak. She slowly approached the podium. "I know nothing I say will bring Jonathan back," she began softly. "He loved me even after learning the darkest parts of my life. He believed truth could heal wounds that fear never could." She paused. "I believed I was protecting everyone." Her voice broke. "But I was only protecting the prison I'd built around myself." The courtroom remained silent. "I ask forgiveness from those I have hurt, though I understand I may never deserve it." The judge sentenced Rebecca to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole according to state law. As deputies escorted her from the courtroom, she turned only once, looking toward the empty seat where Jonathan would have sat had fate chosen differently. The trial ended. The consequences did not. Ashbrook Community Church struggled to recover from the revelations surrounding its beloved pastor and his wife. Sunday attendance dropped as longtime members quietly drifted away, unable to separate their faith from the painful memories surrounding Jonathan's death. Others refused to abandon the congregation. Instead, they gathered in small discussion groups to confront difficult questions they had spent years avoiding. Could silence ever protect someone without causing greater harm? Why had an entire family hidden abuse to preserve its reputation? How many victims remained trapped because fear seemed safer than truth? The conversations were often uncomfortable. Some members condemned Rebecca completely, arguing her suffering could never justify murder. Others acknowledged her crime while recognizing the devastating impact childhood abuse had left upon her life. Forgiveness became the most debated word inside the church. Many realized forgiveness did not erase accountability, just as accountability did not erase compassion. Jonathan's sermons suddenly carried new meaning. People returned to his handwritten notes, discovering repeated reminders that honesty required courage long before it produced peace. Weeks later, Detective Olivia Grant visited the cemetery overlooking Ashbrook. Autumn leaves drifted gently across quiet pathways as she approached Jonathan Hale's grave carrying a single bouquet of white lilies. She placed the flowers carefully beside the polished headstone before reading the inscription aloud. "A faithful shepherd who chose truth." Olivia stood silently for several minutes. She thought about Rebecca sitting alone inside a prison cell. She thought about Sarah Carter, whose death had disappeared beneath decades of deception. She thought about Jonathan, who had believed exposing painful truth would finally free everyone involved. Instead, it had cost him his life. Justice had uncovered the facts. It had punished the guilty, Yet none of it could restore stolen years or erase the suffering hidden behind respectable appearances. As Olivia turned to leave, the afternoon wind rustled through nearby trees, carrying the distant sound of church bells across the valley. She realized justice often arrived long after courage demanded its price. The hardest part of every investigation was accepting that truth could solve a crime without ever healing the hearts left behind. Still, one final chapter remained before Jonathan Hale's story would truly come to an end. Winter arrived quietly in Ashbrook, covering the church cemetery with a thin blanket of frost that softened even the deepest scars carved into the landscape. Months had passed since Rebecca Hale's conviction, yet the consequences of Jonathan Hale's final decision continued unfolding throughout the town. The courtroom had closed, the headlines had faded, and television crews had moved on. What remained behind was something far more enduring than public attention. It was a community learning that healing required far more courage than silence had ever demanded. With permission from Jonathan's surviving relatives, the church board decided to publish his unfinished writings. Rather than focusing only on the investigation or the tragedy surrounding his death, the collection included years of sermons, private reflections, counseling notes, and journal entries discussing forgiveness, accountability, and the importance of confronting painful truths before they consumed entire lives. The book's final chapter contained the message Jonathan had never lived to deliver. "I have learned," he wrote, "that truth is not the enemy of healing. Fear is. Secrets often begin as shields protecting frightened hearts, but if carried too long, those same shields become prisons. If you have survived abuse, manipulation, or violence, know that your silence does not define your worth. Find someone worthy of your trust. Speak while there is still time. Hidden wounds cannot become healed wounds until they are finally seen." Readers across the state shared Jonathan's words through churches, counseling centers, and victim advocacy groups. Survivors recognized their own struggles inside his reflections, while community leaders began discussing how institutions often failed those trapped by fear and misplaced loyalty. Jonathan's voice, once silenced by poison, somehow reached more people after his death than it ever had during his lifetime. Inside the state correctional facility, Rebecca settled into a quiet routine. Every morning she borrowed paper from the prison library before returning to her small cell overlooking a fenced exercise yard. She spent countless hours writing letters addressed to people she would never contact. Some were written to Jonathan, apologizing for choosing fear over love. Others were addressed to Sarah, the younger sister whose memory had haunted every year of Rebecca's adult life. She even wrote to strangers who had survived abuse, urging them never to repeat her mistakes. None of the letters were mailed. She folded each page carefully before placing it inside a weathered cardboard box beneath her bed. One afternoon, the prison chaplain asked whether she wished to send any of them. Rebecca gently shook her head. "They aren't for anyone else," she answered. "They're reminders of the conversations I should have had years ago." News eventually reached the prison library that Jonathan's writings had become widely read. Rebecca quietly requested a copy. She spent hours reading every page, stopping often as tears blurred the words before her. When she reached Jonathan's final message, she closed the book against her chest and wept openly for the first time since her conviction. The terrible truth settled fully within her heart. The secret she had poisoned Jonathan to protect had become public anyway. The murder had accomplished nothing except adding another innocent life to a tragedy that had already lasted decades. Meanwhile, Detective Olivia Grant completed the last administrative reports connected to the Hale investigation. The evidence had been cataloged, appeals were underway, and every remaining document had found its proper place inside the department archives. Late one evening, Olivia opened the thick case file one final time. Photographs of the anniversary dinner rested beside forensic reports, witness statements, journal pages, and courtroom exhibits. Every piece of evidence told part of the same heartbreaking story. She slowly closed the folder. Looking through her office window toward the fading sunset, Olivia reflected upon everything the investigation had revealed. Evil rarely announced itself through spectacular acts of violence. More often, it began with a single hidden lie. That lie demanded another, then another. Eventually fear replaced honesty, Silence replaced justice, and ordinary people convinced themselves they were protecting loved ones, while unknowingly building the very tragedies they hoped to avoid. Jonathan Hale had refused to let that cycle continue. Although telling the truth cost him his life, it also inspired lasting change. His family, together with church leaders and local advocates, established the Jonathan Hale Foundation, providing counseling resources for survivors of domestic abuse, educational programs encouraging accountability within trusted institutions, and emergency assistance for victims seeking safe places to rebuild their lives. Each scholarship awarded, counseling session funded, and family protected became another chapter in Jonathan's enduring legacy. His story no longer belonged only to Ashbrook. It belonged to everyone courageous enough to believe that even the most painful truth remained stronger than the silence that tried to bury it forever.